War and Peace Report. And by the way, on election night, Democracy Now! Will be doing a 5-hour special, broadcasting on radio and television stations around the country. You can ask your station if we'll be running Democracy Now! We'll also be streaming live at democracynow.org, so you can watch and listen to the show on our website. Juan?
Well, with the election 4 days away, North Carolina has emerged as a key battleground state for the first time in decades. Senator Barack Obama is attempting to become the first Democratic presidential candidate to win the state since 1976. Obama campaigned in Raleigh, North Carolina on Wednesday. He's scheduled to campaign today in Sarasota, Florida, and Virginia Beach, Virginia. Republican John McCain held multiple rallies in Florida on Wednesday and campaigned in Fayetteville, North Carolina on Tuesday. 4 years ago, President Bush swept the southern states, but polls show Barack Obama could win North Carolina, Virginia, and Florida.
Our next guest has been closely following the presidential race in the South. Chris Kromm, executive director of the Institute for Southern Studies, publisher of the journal Southern Exposure. He writes for the blog Facing South at southernstudies.org/Facing South. He joins us in Raleigh. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Chris. Talk about what's happening now in the states that have early voting, a state of emergency declared by the Republican governor, Governor Christ of Florida, saying he wants the polling stations open for 12 hours a day right through the election, including Saturday and Sunday, and some local elections officials balking and saying they're not going to do it.
Well, this is clearly a historic election, and for the first time in decades, key states in the South are in play and could decide the election this year. So I think everybody is paying attention to what's happening in the South, and I think it's what we're seeing is a train wreck where an easily anticipated record turnout across the South, people turning out in record numbers, registering in record numbers, but for some reason it seems election officials in many of these key southern states have still been unprepared for the deluge of voters. And you saw that most clearly in Florida, this key swing state with 27 electoral college votes, people waiting in line 4 hours, 6 hours in Miami-Dade County. And this is a big problem. It means disenfranchisement for people who have to work, who have families to take care of, if they have health problems. People just can't stand in line that long. And finally, after early voting started on October 20th, it wasn't until yesterday that the state took action and decided this is a state of emergency, and they needed to extend both the hours and the polling locations to accommodate this record turnout.
Well, Chris Kromm, that's exactly was going to be my question. Because these long lines, when clearly while you're getting many people voting, it's not as if it's actually election day. The problem is the number of polling places that are open for early voting in many of these states. How many states are doing early voting for the first time this year, as opposed to having done it in previous elections?
Well, a lot of these states, they're coming online for the first time of doing early voting, and that's the deep irony about this. This was a reform that a lot of people really pushed for because they're worried about the long lines. Some people may remember in 2004, there's a lot of speculation, some pretty hard evidence that in a state like Ohio, long lines could have really made the difference. One estimate has it that up to 129,000 voters in the state of Ohio just walked away because the lines were too long in places like Cleveland and other major metro areas. And that was a state that's decided by a few tens of thousand voters less than that. So this is the sort of thing that can change an election. People don't understand that long lines and long waits, that's a voting rights issue. And what it gets to is whether or not a state is prepared. And the whole idea behind early voting was to take the pressure off of Election Day. People had seen those long lines on Election Day. And the whole idea is if you can do early voting, you can take some of the pressure off. But it still seems that election officials didn't anticipate, or they weren't prepared, even though it seemed early in the spring we knew that there was going to be record turnout. But for some reason, these election officials just didn't allocate enough resources and spaces to accommodate these voters.
Isn't it also a great way for people to go to the polls early in the states where they can, in case there's a problem, that they could go back, like if they say, for example, that they aren't registered, that they can begin to deal? Can they come back if they're turned away once?
Oh, exactly. And this isn't to say that people shouldn't try early voting. And we don't want to scare people into thinking they shouldn't go try to vote because there'll be a long line. You can always check online. There's a number of websites that are cropping up that'll tell you what the waits are at different early voting sites. So people should definitely keep at it. But this criticism is directed at the election officials. And so, for example, in Florida, in 2005, a Republican-controlled legislature pushed through legislation limiting the number of early voting sites and the hours that they could operate in that state. And a lot of people are saying that that is the reason why we're seeing the long lines today. So this is a question of policy. You can avoid these kind of problems if you have the right policy in place to accommodate the voters. And that's why it took an executive order, the governor of Florida, Charlie Crist, saying it was a state of emergency. You needed that to change it in the state of Florida. And now you're looking at other states. The same issue is happening in Georgia, and right now the Secretary of State and the governor are saying that they're throwing their hands up in the air and saying they can't do anything.
Well, I'd like to add that it's not just in the South. Reports here in New York City and New York State in the past few days indicate that election officials don't have enough people assigned for Election Day for the expected surge of voters, and they're looking at a possible major problem here in terms of huge lines on Election Day here in New York State. It just seems to be almost that the country got used to the fact that about 50% of the population was actually voting in elections, and if it gets up to 60 or 70%, there seems to be almost like a meltdown in the system's ability to be able to handle that many voters.
It is, and you do see it across the country. We focus on the South, obviously, and I think there's a unique history of how this affects voters in the South. Clearly, I think all the research suggests that when you have these long lines, the impact